right. Lizzie, Anna, can you all hear us?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. I'm doing drop off today, so I just am listening for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you all for coming. Just want to make sure we were up and running. So I will call the meeting to order at 8:04 a.m. And kind of first thing up is the FY25 budget update. So the framing is we were waiting for Katie to get a little bit more information on how some of the final payrolls were coming in and last end of year purchases. I think you were closing out stipends and some other things. See kind of where we are, where we seem to be landing at a high level. We don't have a report in the finance file. So maybe that's something that's still working on, and we could see maybe next week at our meeting was scheduled for the 4th. But do you want to walk us through a high level where we stand?
Sure. So the last that we had discussed things kind of publicly in our finance subcommittee and full school committee meeting, we had been looking at the third quarter financial report. And in that report, we had projected out what we kind of based off of the information that we had at that time, what the balance was looking like for the end of the year. We are still running in a deficit. We have been running in a deficit pretty consistently all year. And when I say running in a deficit, it's a projected deficit to close out the fiscal year as of June 30th. So at the last quarterly report, we had said that the deficit was just under 800,000 projected. And we were based off of that number and that 800,000. I also want to be very clear that that 800,000 is also assuming that we are going to get supplemental circuit breaker funding from the state. So there's currently a proposal for fiscal year 25 supplemental state funding that is making its way through the approval process. So that 800,000 is taking into account that funding will be allocated to us for us to be able to utilize for this fiscal year. So since the March report, again, we go through the process of making sure that we're running reports, just making sure that the information is in the accounting system. If it's not in the accounting system, it's something that we are tracking either manually on spreadsheets or through some other mechanism to be able to track towards June 30th. So since that time, there's been a number of changes, and the changes, unfortunately, are not working in our favor. So there have been increases both on the salary side and the general expense side that is pushing the deficit projection for the end of the year. It's creating a larger deficit for the end of the year. So that 800,000 is increasing. And so I just wanted to talk about some of the changes that we're seeing, some of the changes that we may continue to see, because we're still, we still have about three and a half, 4 weeks of school left. And so we're still spending money. So one of the changes that we've seen, we process stipend payments incrementally throughout the year. For our extracurricular stipend payments, they're done in the fall and then in the spring. And then the coaches' stipend payments are done at the end of the regular season. And so for the spring stipend payments and then the spring coaching stipends, there is an increase to that stipends of approximately $44,000. Some of those stipends are still even trickling in now. So it's $44,000 more than what we had originally projected in the budget. So that, of course, that's just one of the areas of an increase. We're also seeing an increase to some of the substitute coverage, so we talked about sub coverage pretty frequently over the course of our meetings this year. For two reasons, one being the budget for this year and historically has been underfunded. And so we really tried to make a concerted effort to adjust that for fiscal year 26, which we did, and that was approved, which is it's positive for next year. For this year, however, we're operating in a deficit specifically in the substitute line, and this what we projected to utilize for the last quarter of the year, the expenses are in excess of that. And so for one of the schools, just a specific example, for one of the schools, we had put in a placeholder for $20,000 for the remainder of the year. And in this last payroll, that one school, the expense was $20,000. So it truly is in excess of what we've spent in the past and certainly what we projected. So that is causing us to see an increase to the expenses. We've also continued to receive invoices for expenses that were tied to this fiscal year that weren't in the system anywhere, and they're just expenses that just we receive on an annual basis, but there were no purchase orders to reflect that expense was still outstanding. And so some examples of that is we've received invoices for our district physician that we utilize. For one of the programs at the high school, we received an invoice, and there are still invoices outstanding for some of the translation and ELL services that we contract out that weren't encumbered or put into the system. So those are all different things that come in just piece by piece, but they add up, especially when they were unknown, so they weren't already memorialized in the March report. We've had some student changes that are causing us to really take pause because the expenses weren't reflected in the budget. So we have some transportation for foster students. The students are starting, obviously a mid-year start, and there's still an expense from now until the end of the year. So we have to take that into account. In those situations, sometimes our notification is when we are receiving an invoice from the district that we are either sending to or receiving from. So that's something that actually just came up within the last week or so, that it wasn't again memorialized in the budget for the Q3 report. So that's something that's adding pressure to the deficit that we're seeing for the end of the fiscal year. So when we had originally, just to kind of bring us back, the original deficit projection, when we first started talking about this in the Q2 report, we were at about 2.2 million. We made a number of different adjustments. We instituted a purchase order freeze. We instituted a hiring freeze. But because school is still operating, we're still spending money. And in some instances, the expenses just weren't memorialized in a way that they were captured on some of the projections. So we are continuing to show that deficit. So we're hopeful that we can land around the 800,000. But now it looks like it's going to be in excess of that. So I think just it's almost June, and we need to be able to close the books on June 30th. So I just wanted to provide that update. Obviously, I it's not I was very hopeful that we'd be able to pull from different, if we had to utilize funding from other revolving accounts just to cover some incremental changes. That was really my hope at the end or in April. But because we utilized a lot of the majority of the reserves to close the books last year, that was the mechanism in which we covered the deficit that we had last year. There is really not any reserve funding from revolving accounts that we can utilize to offset some of these expenses. So, and I also, we're also just trying to be very mindful of what we're utilizing from revolving funds because we want to make sure that we're well positioned for next fiscal year.
Do you have an estimate currently on, so again, Q2 was the 2.2 million projected deficit, Q3 it was a little under 800,000, 750, 60 I think it was. What is your current projection now, still assuming we get the state funding?
So the estimated projection right now would be 1,090,000. That's an estimate.
So obviously that is aligned with kind of our original requests for the funding for the full $1 million of special ed circuit breaker funding. Up 700. That was more, so I thought that was more in line with our current projections. So we need to clearly work with the select board, potentially the warrant committee. This additional request will flag for Louisiana. Amy Dexter is sitting in a room with us, so the town is being looped into this, and Amy have said they need to continue to talk about kind of the path forward here. So just on that point, assuming people let us know what this means in terms of the June town meeting, if there's anything, select board already had a warrant committee article to allocate the additional 300,000. If there's something else we need to do, that's what options there are, what things to move on. Concern the June is if there's some warrant article or request town meeting outside of just the $300,000 warrant article, is that we're out of time. I think that we need to get in front of the warrant committee last week. I'm not sure when this is going to print, when just assume that's like today. So that's my only sense of like timing, if y'all can get clarity on that ASAP. There's a special meeting we would need to have to address that. Hopefully there are other mechanisms, but something like that. Anna?
Hey, Katie, I just had a quick question. Thank you for kind of explaining everything. I just had a quick question on the stipends. What was kind of the reasoning for the increase in those payments? Like, did we have to add more stipends than we originally budgeted, or like what are your kind of thoughts, take on that?
So I think it's the majority of the overages for the stipend payments were tied to the spring coaches.
Okay.
So when I had originally projected or put a placeholder in the budget just based off of the previous season's actuals, it wasn't necessarily like I don't receive in my office a list of the coaches that are working before the season. We pretty much I received the information after. And so just another example of kind of process that needs to be just tightened, especially from not only from my perspective of being able to project, but also from kind of the director's perspective of being able to stick within the budget.
Yeah.
So that's just one example, and I even went into some of our previous budget updates that we had talked about during finance subcommittee. And you can see when we had talked about the spring season, and we had even talked about like, do we just not have spring athletics, which obviously we did, and the savings was even being projected at 150,000. So if you can see that number was just inaccurate. I was just carrying an inaccurate number.
Okay,
Just
okay,
not having the information.
got it.
So the
Thank you.
project, yeah, no, on that line, the projected amount was about 150,000 for the sports springs coaches stipends. And it ended up being closer to 200,000.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
188.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that just seems like a process piece of like how do we, you know, have that budget in terms of how many coaches they need, which how that works. Well, big questions.
Okay.
I guess I continue as we think about this year and next year is this additional information. I know we're gonna do the reforecasting, right, in August, we talked about that. But are there already things we should be talking about as a committee based upon these additional projections? Because unless we're cutting spring sports next year to reduce this amount, or unless we're somehow implementing a new coverage plan next year to reduce coverage costs for next year, I assume these are costs that are gonna kind of be baked into our expenses for next year. Like foster care, transportation is a bit unexpected, but we should expect that it's unexpected and that we'll have some costs. So are there, you know, a $300,000 jump is not insignificant given 81% of our budget is salaries and positions, and we don't have an ability to cut those once the year starts. So question is just like, do you still feel good about the budget that we created, or are there things that we need to think about in discussion of cutting, whether programming or positions for next year? Now, before we hit July 1st or August 15th, whenever we have recasting.
When I think about administering the budget for this year, so coming in July and administering a budget that was already set, right? It becomes difficult administering a budget and trying to balance the budget when their revolving funds are, there aren't any reserves. And so I think in looking at next year, even though we truly focused on making sure that the budget was a reflection of previous expenses and not just carrying the same number over, we still need to, it is going to be a multi-year process for us to look at the budget and try to make sure that those revolving accounts are at an appropriate level to sustain us, so that if there's any changes, it's not to the operating budget, it's not as impactful as it really has felt this year. And so I think that all being said, it's also having Mr. Phelan come in, I think is an opportunity to kind of look at the budget, and he may have some ideas when looking at the budget of changes that we could make to make sure that the budget that we can operate within the budget that was appropriated to us at town meeting, and that truly has to be the focus for next year. And so the budget recast will be really important over the summer, but I do think that we just need to be very mindful of looking at every single position, every single expense, every single contracted service for next year, just to make sure that everything, every single individual line is within the budget. So I don't know if that,
Yeah, I mean, it does, and obviously John's starting next week, and so this as an expertise, I think it'd be helpful. I just want to make sure
yeah,
we're not waiting too long, like
no,
every step we can take to kind of address this. And again, some of this just feels like, as you said, like process improvements around like, how is the athletic director able to spend $44,000 more, or 30,000, more than they had allocated, right? What's the approval to like say, like, actually you can't hire that other coach or have this team because you don't have the money for it.
Yeah.
And so like, what are the processes and this is something you talked about, just will take time to implement those and keep people ownership of their budget. But yeah, we're not gonna have the reserves next year, which is not, it's gonna, as you've said, take multiple years to build those up. So we can't go through this multiple
No,
years.
we
And so I know we're all in agreement on that, obviously. So just other things we need to do now to build us greater flexibility into next year's budget, not be in a situation even if that means some change to programming or staffing, that again, we just need to suck up now.
And looking at the coverage issue again, I mean, it is successful the way we've done group coverage here now at the high school. How can we develop a model that's more efficient and effective at the middle school? So that's a big budget item that has continued to be problematic for us.
No, I agree, and I think it's some of the stuff that we've talked about around the process piece, and then I had the same question, like how do we just add teams or add activities without a budget? You know what I mean? Without there being a process in place for that to happen. So it's sort of like, to your point, if there is a X amount for an extracurricular budget for a school, that's the budget for the school. So you don't add programs, you don't add teams, you don't add. And so, and recognizing that, I do recognize, Katie, that you came in, you have a budget that you didn't create. So there are probably some assumptions or understandings of how things would be backfilled or done. And so some of these things coming in and not recognizing that was the process, or that was an opportunity for the budget to grow there is obviously extremely challenging. So if there are things that we start seeing like this, like things coming through that don't have a PO attached to them, so there's no way to memorialize the spending for stipends, for I think all of those things, because to your point, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, right?
It
It's
is.
like 40,000 here, 44,000 there, 30,000 there, so it just all adds up. And yeah, so, and I think I did have the same question as Mark, which is making, starting sooner than later, and it's really being, again, looking at it with a really critical eye, knowing that it's already very tight, but do we have things in place? Are we looking at it to make sure that, do we need to be tighter?
And I think there's always room for improvement. There's always going to be progress that we can make. I talked in having an opportunity to sit and talk with John, even though he hasn't even started yet, but I've filled him in quite a bit on some of the experience that I had over the past year. And I don't want to speak for him, but I know that he is really committed to making sure that we are sticking to the budget. And even as far as saying, like, anytime anyone even thinks about spending money, it needs to be approved here before we actually go out and make a purchase. And I think that is, for me, as someone who is working really hard to manage and then again administer the budget through the year, that's really reassuring, because it's really difficult if different departments are just moving forward with purchases, and not making sure that that it's being pre-approved before the purchase is being made. So I think an area of opportunity, but it's also, we've identified it, and I think next year John will be really committed to making sure that people are following through with that. Because it's one thing to say it, right? Like I've been trying to say it, but if we aren't actually doing it, then that's where these issues arise. So I think having that commitment to say it and then also follow through with it. That's something that that will be kind of the reality of moving forward.
What visibility do, maybe I should know this, what visibility do like directors, department, like budget owners have in their own budget? How often do they get? I assume our system is, again, from what my understanding, pretty outdated. They don't have real-time access to information. Like, how do they get monthly reports, weekly report, like what do they have?
So at the beginning of the year, we provided monthly reports. The principals would each get a report. The reports are more of the general expenses too, which are a smaller portion of the budget, but they could see exactly the funding that they had for their office supplies, for curriculum materials. The budgets are very much broken out at the school level, but the curriculum directors do, when they make curriculum purchases, it is assigned against the school budget. So we're just working on that whole process of how do we communicate that the principals know that that funding is being taken from their budget. So we've worked on that a lot this year. But I really tried to start meeting with them and going through, making sure that they could see the budget, that they were tracking the budget, that they knew how much money was available. That started at the beginning of the year, and then once we hit January and we projected after the Q2 report, we essentially stopped having those meetings because we froze all purchases. So it was kind of like, stop spending money, because we are trying really to limit any of the expenses. But I think that will, for next year, it will be a similar process of making sure that the information is shared with them all at an appropriate frequency so they could see and manage the budgets. And I think just expanding it shouldn't just be general expenses. It's even the substitute budget, they don't have great visibility in, but being able to see that and manage that, and I think just that shared ownership will be helpful.
That's at the school level, is that, like, at the school level, is it also done at different department levels? So like, I'm just thinking like Danielle, does she get her budget? All of those.
Danielle, so for special ed, we've been trying to meet once a month throughout the year. They do have, in addition to the reports that we have in the accounting system, they do have a number of different spreadsheets that have budget information that are shared, that we both have access to look at any point in the year. And so we've met throughout the course of the year to look at the budget. I think, again, like, there's opportunity to improve some of the work that we're doing, but we really have worked pretty hard at it this year. So I feel like that we will improve some of that process. Some of these the point that we talked about earlier, like some of the expenses truly are just like, we wouldn't be able to, we would never be able to anticipate that they were going to happen, but we can make sure that we budget appropriately. So, so definitely with special ed, and there's room for improvement in different departments as well, but
I just want to be mindful of halfway through the meeting. Sorry. Okay.
I mean, Katie, she has really worked with the principals in terms of the budgeting. It's a culture shift for the school leadership here to be thinking and talking about budgets. They will tell you that they actually, in past leadership regimes, did not have an opportunity to understand what their budget was, to see it. So they are learning, being supported by Katie on that, but it has been a challenge to understand that and operationalize it. And I know you've been really conscientious about meeting with them, Katie, but it's a change in terms of their job responsibilities looking at that.
I do think the other piece that I think we, schools is hard is like giving them ownership of the budget. In my mind is also though being clear about like, you know, what is hitting their budget that they actually can say yes or no to, there's what they can't. So like we're telling them like, hey, you gotta spend $300,000 on this thing. You know, that is like a district initiative, like well, then should have like their budget versus district budgets. And that just to make sure that, because otherwise if they keep getting costs that feel like they can't control them, it's like, well, what's the point anyway? You're charging me 100, like I'm gonna type to this budget and you're coming at $150,000 charge. I can't say no to. So that's always something that we've again just worked on at our own schools. Pull that off the school budget in ways or make that clear.
And on a very small portion of that, we've had those discussions about professional development and what is the individual school's professional development line versus the whole districts, and how to find that balance where a principal has permission in their building to say, yes, this works and is important to my staff, versus at the district leadership level determining what the professional development should be.
And the budget.
Yeah.
The budget that's assigned to.
And we're in that process and procedure. Yesterday we spent some time with the principals talking about what actual process will be for approval of professional development that would be supported by the district. So it has many tentacles, as you know, Mark, very well.
For our next week meeting, is there any additional kind of data report around different updated kind of projections that you expect to be able to provide to us? Is there like not a, I guess, Q 3.5 report or something like that? Like what are you thinking of, if anything, and then is there anything you would like to see?
My plan is just to, so we are pressing, this is a payroll week.
Yeah.
And so after every payroll that is run and posted, I am rerunning on it will be almost a weekly basis, rerunning the financial reports, just to make sure, you know, to double check and see where we are. And so if you would like to see the actual numbers, if you would like me to provide kind of like a cost center summary, I can certainly do that. I can provide you the line level detail report from the accounting system, whatever information would be helpful.
I feel like for me, and just for, you know, knowing that not every school committee member is on here, and for the community, having maybe a top, like a recap of, it sort of feels like initial projection Q2, where we got to the last report, and then now what we're projecting, and then those bucket areas that were unanticipated.
Sure.
I think seeing, you know, because I think some of them are a surprise, like I'm saying this wasn't what I expected you to say.
Yeah.
So having that and seeing where we're tracking against them would be helpful. Sure. I don't know that we need to be deep into the lines.
Yeah, Yeah, I don't think we need a projection for every line item, but yeah, no, I
Yeah.
agree with you. I think the overall
So-
number and then, yeah, the summary kind of where it is, and then just completely agree with kind of essentially everything meant.
Yeah.
I think that'll help the other members, given a student ways to
Yeah.
have some type of vote on this to ask for the additional funding.
But
So kind of walking through that timeline,
Yeah.
like what has changed, requiring that also being full for any communication we have with the warrant committee is the one that comes to mind. And then, so sharing something, so what's going on.
so, like, I hate asking these questions, but that's it, so, you know. What's the scenario where, so it's, you know, $1.90 million. We've talked about. Originally, the original ask was $1 million, we're down to 700, we go to the town. Then town's financing will impact that, like what they can do, right? So the 300, so what if, like, what's the scenario where? How does this work? We're asking for, we're over, like, we're over that million within we're already 90,000 over that million right now projected. But even within that, like, what's the scenario if the town doesn't have money? Are there ways to work with the town to? I'm just trying to think, like, what does this look like? Is this just a sit down with Nick and Amy and see what can be done, and then we're back with a realistic number, and then recognizing, but at the end of the day, like, we have to close the books. I just don't, kind of getting an understanding of that process and our, what else do we have? So is that, so that would be the next step, right, would be meeting with the town?
The next step is definitely meeting with the town, and just. Because I don't know, I don't have those answers,
Yeah.
especially from the town side,
Yeah.
and I also have never been in this situation, so I can't even pull from my previous experience, because I just don't know. And I think that's why, right, when we talk about like talking about this in January, that's why, or even to your point, like, we talk about it now, so we don't have to figure these things out. So I don't know, I will absolutely connect, Amy and I will connect, we can, and connect with Nick and just figure out what our options are.
Yeah.
And then we can certainly discuss, that at the next meeting, and we can update you.
Okay.
There's a for Anna and Lizzie too, there's the $300,000 that was not allocated towards anything within the May town meeting. That was originally going to the special ed reserve accounts that the select board didn't allocate there in case of other needs for. There's one article in the June town meeting to allocate that to the town reserve account. I'm probably calling it the wrong name, but essentially where the 700,000 went. But I think the town is, they had some overages related to ice and snow and maybe some other things, not to speak to the town, that they were looking to tap into potentially some of that money, and or there's already, I think, 250,000 in there, kind of standard start of the year stuff. So, so yeah, I think, yeah, all of that's gonna have to be figured out between kind of what the town's projected expenses and or overages are versus the schools beyond 700, or inclusive of the 700,000 beyond that. Yeah, we might need to have more into reserves than we really want to. Some of these other places. There are other brilliant ideas that Amy and Nick have. I know, but I think, yeah, that getting clarity on that for next week meeting. Sooner than later, just because I think we would need to, there's some vote that is required in that on the agenda. Finance committee that discuss it.
Just have to, just.
I
I know. I know.
Yeah.
Talk about it.
Yeah. Anything else on that item? All right, next up, we had the discussion of the townwide finance committee. We kind of talked about this, and I should probably say finance committee, because we talked about the tri-board. We talked about this at full school committee, so we already gave that update. There's nothing else at this point. I haven't heard back from Nick at their last select board meeting. They didn't do anything on this. They gave a brief update, but no vote or clarity on it. So I think that's still, the ball is still in town administrator's court. Create the overview and for select board to kind of vote to create that. So that is where that stands. Jumping down to new business, I'll jump to item C real quick because it's somewhat aligns. I do think we should also reconnect with town administrator on this kind of budgeting best practice consultant. I know that's something that, given some unexpected costs within the town, that the opportunity for funding in FY 25 is gonna make that pretty challenging. This is something we need to push to FY 26. That clarity and starting to align on kind of what that RFP, whatever it is, looks like with the town would be helpful to do. So I can poke Nick on that and with you on it, just to see if there's any support we can find and moving that forward. Jumping back up, the community school salary scale. So this is a document that's in the finance committee meeting agenda for anybody who's following along here. Do you want to, I can share my screen. Do you want to walk us through this?
So, for community schools, the salary table, I believe has historically been reviewed and approved, by the school committee. The, community schools employees are not part of any of the collective bargaining agreements, so we do set the salary table each year. And although community schools employees are not tied to the bargaining agreements, they are not members of any of the collective bargaining agreements. Some of the employees are employees of Milton Public Schools during the day. And so we very much try to look at the rates and align them to the increases that we're seeing in the collective bargaining agreement. So that's what we did for next year. So you can see going through, there is a cost of living adjustment that's been applied to each one of the steps and each one of the rates on the proposed salary table. The cost of living adjustment varies just because we did try to stay in line to, if some of these are typically reflected of similar rates in collective bargaining agreements, we try to stay consistent with that. And so you can just see the COLA is listed here, the effective date, and then there's some other notes that is included in this projection as well. I reviewed this with the director of the community schools program. And when we reviewed the rates, we very much tried to make sure that we were tying it back to the balance for community schools for next year. So and making sure that the program continues to stay self-sustaining. So.
Couple questions. Just to kind of go line. So for number one, before this proposal, it would just be essentially step 3 was step 2. So if whatever the 2% less than the $2,744, went from that to the 2,883. So in this year, proposing adding that middle step, make it a which essentially makes it 2.5% increase between step 1, 2, 3. 4.
Correct, yes,
Previously was a larger jump from step 1 to step
Right.
2. Is there particular feedback? I guess, well, usually when you have a larger jump from one to the next, it's because you want to retain and you want kind of a higher
Mhm.
jump. I guess it's not a concern. Just lowering that, because I assume this was essentially lowering step 2, folks, anybody who's going from step 1 to step 2 next year now is actually going to receive less than maybe what they were anticipating to receive.
I will, that's not something that Martha and I really discussed. So I can ask her and I can get her feedback on that. Because we didn't even really have any conversations about that. So in saying that, she also did not bring up any concerns
Okay.
with making that change, and that change would have been something that she proposed, so.
Yeah. I just like the 2% less than step 3 is 2,826.
Mhm.
Which is more than the 2,814. So it is a like, if you could talk through that.
Yeah, of course.
Different, and then we
Sure.
obviously have the larger jump from step 4 to step 5. That's like a
Yeah,
7.5% increase. I guess the question there is just like the
yeah,
thinking around.
sure. I'll ask.
Okay. Other thing, I guess, with number 1 is in looking at number 13, the director. I think the program supervisors, my understanding, those are like the on-site leaders. Wonderful, love them. Directors, Martha. Steps for the program supervisors, they report to Martha. But those steps are lower than the directors, so they pay more than the director. I defer to y'all on certainly not those paying those program supervisors. Well, they're wonderful, work really hard. But just flagging that too. I didn't know if this like the director is actually a step, because I assume the pending is just kind of where Martha is
Yeah.
falling, and so it's really not as much of a scale. It doesn't really matter unless she leaves.
Right.
It's negotiated anyways.
It is, so that director level position is that's a self-contract position.
Yeah.
Meaning Martha has a contract between, herself and
Yeah.
Milton Public Schools. I think historically it's always been kind of listed in here, but it almost doesn't make sense that
We
it's
don't
listed in.
necessarily follow those steps.
Right, and so it's not like if you had a new director start, to your
They do.
point, like that they would have to start at step 1, they would just come in and essentially negotiate their contract.
Yeah, and maybe this provides helpful guidance for
Yes.
those negotiations, but.
Yeah. Yeah.
If that's true, it also seems like
Yeah.
they haven't been adjusted or out of line, because assume they should be higher than. Assume you maybe look at a program supervisor looking into that role, and they're not gonna take a pay cut to take a larger role.
Right,
So
Right.
anyways,
yeah, no, 100%, and I think that it almost like doesn't, for me, I would just take that director out, because it almost like I see kind of the reference of saying like, okay, step 4 is a program supervisor. You're making essentially more than what step 4 director would be. But that step 4 director would not be step 4 of this year. It was step 4 of, or whatever, that was the rate a number of years ago. So, you know what I mean? 'Cause
yeah, I
that
guess I'm
was-
sorry, these really aren't steps, they are just like.
Right.
The director
It's just
earned
the
in past,
history.
as step 7 is FY 26.
Correct,
So, okay,
yes.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's not really steps.
Mhm. Correct, yes, yeah,
Other question, just inclusion coordinator versus program supervisor, obviously those rates are same.
Mhm.
What is the difference in those responsibilities? Again, I assume Martha's like thought about this and says they deserve to be paid the same because they're doing so much work, but.
Mhm. So the inclusion coordinator is a newer position. And the inclusion coordinator is their focus is truly making sure that all of the students can have the opportunity to access the programs. And if there's any type of like supports that those students need, just making sure that there's communication between the inclusion coordinator, the families, the director, the inclusion aides. So we do have a number of inclusion aides that if some of the students just need additional support above and beyond kind of the support of the group leaders and some of the other staff members that are there. Those inclusion aides are doing that kind of like at each one of the schools, but the coordinator is really helping with all of that work. Martha and the inclusion coordinator have done a lot of work just in looking at like, how do we almost document and just see what the needs are of all of the students? It's not through the formalized process of being an individual education plan, but it's a similar process of just making sure that students have access to any of the extracurricular kind of opportunities that happen during community schools. So all of that being said, just Martha felt that position really did align in kind of the responsibilities and the work that happens in that position. It did best align with the program supervisor position. So just in updating the salary table just to reflect that. And we talked about potentially like almost just creating, instead of having them separate, just creating one category. But for now, we wanted to keep them separate because they truly are separate roles.
Sorry, how many inclusion coordinators are there?
Just one.
Just one for
Yeah.
across the whole district.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Then comparatively, so program supervisor, like how many people are they responsible for versus the inclusion?
The program supervisor is, we have one at each one of the schools. So they're responsible for the programs at each one of the locations.
And then, but then the inclusion coordinator is responsible for just the inclusion aides.
So I don't know that there's like a direct reporting structure, but the inclusion coordinator is working at all of the sites and working closely with the inclusion aides and working closely with the families, more in a support.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Kind of like more specific to like specific student need
Right.
in accessing the program.
yeah, I don't know if there's particular qualifications that make us think it's gonna be hard to get an inclusion coordinator and therefore it needs to be paid on the same, but similar thought, just
Yeah.
program supervisors oversee so many, there are so many staff and kids on site, and for that to be equivalent for a role that is not directly supervising any particular staff member, and it's like school process. To me, that feels out of line with looking at this in terms of hearing those duties. I do defer to Martha in terms of what y'all need for recruitment. I guess I'd worry about, if I'm a program supervisor. Yes, I'd say like, well, I can get paid the same amount to like not manage anybody. That to me feels like maybe I'm again not thinking about the role and fully understanding it correctly, but I just would hate to lose really strong program supervisors to this other role, given the skill set of the program supervisor. It takes a lot to be in there. But that's my 2 cents for the district.
I hear you, Mark. Having observed them, they're also, do all the activity development and lead the way on not just staffing.
And again, the program is only increased in size, and therefore the number of staff we're putting under them is only increased in size. Talking about a 2% COLA. And also to be clear, these, I think we didn't, maybe I missed, you maybe provided the context, I missed it, but these salaries are not associated with our budget. This is associated with the school department budget overall. This is associated with the fees for community schools.
Correct.
So it's a self-funded program.
Correct.
It's not, it increases, this doesn't negatively impact our.
And that's why we wanted to make sure that that it continues to be a self-sustaining program.
Yeah.
We need to make, like, we would love to give everyone larger COLAs, but just staying within the fiscal boundaries of the revenue that we receive.
Totally understand. And the 2% COLA aligns with what has been ratified and agreed to with Unit A
Mhm.
and ratified Unit B. You're asking yet, so. But it's in line with Unit A, and then you said the 3%, because those are staff who are also in Unit D, that's the projected agreement. I guess the last question I had was just the assistant director and the nurse. Is there any reason why there's no additional steps on these? It's just, so the nurse this year earned something, they just will get 2% increase for next year,
Correct.
but no step really, no step change. Same thing for the assistant director.
Correct. Yeah. This year's, I believe, was the first year with the assistant director, so I think it's similar with the director line where it doesn't, it's not necessarily like steps. There are subcontract positions, so it's whatever the increase in that individual contract.
Yeah, then I would definitely remove.
That was-
Assistant director and director maybe is like a separate table below, just
Sure.
like this is their
Yeah.
FY 25, but it
Yeah.
doesn't fit with them. It's not a step. Any questions on that? So our next steps on this one, this is something that needs to be approved by school committee.
I believe so.
So we'd assume take whatever questions they had, Martha, bring kind of a finalized version to this fourth meeting, talk about it briefly in finance, and then assume what others about it. Or chief. Um. All right, next up. Filling some notes. The finance committee calendar. I dropped this in a little late, but I essentially just dropped in a template of the 25-26 budget calendar, which is just pulling. I didn't even change all the FY 24s. So it was just a copy of the current year budget calendar for next year. So I know we're at 9:02, so we can push this next week, but just through, see if there's anything else we want to add to the calendar. So we will talk about that more next week. Same thing with the other kind of new business items. Those to a future meeting. Do you think for NPS grants manual, that's something that we'll have for sure time on the board?
That's okay.
June 11th.
We can absolutely push it. That's just more, we should have the grants manual in place. So that is a template, but it does need to be updated.
Mhm.
So just for kind of an initial conversation, but we don't need to talk about it in depth. I can do work on my side to update the manual because it is out of date, and we can always talk about it at a future meeting.
Okay. Does the school committee need to vote?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
No, it's just, it really is like, with the grants, and I'll have to look at that financial policy. I believe the school committee kind of approves the grants, so in the manual just talks about kind of the procedure and policy on how we administer those grants. I just want to, with any of the federal grants, I want to make sure that we have everything in place so that there isn't any opportunity to turn around and say, well, you didn't have that, so we're not gonna, you'll lose funding, so.
All right, great. Meeting minutes. I owe a few meeting minutes, so I'll try and get that up for our meeting next Wednesday. Discussion of next meeting, date and agenda. We are meeting on the 4th. And we have a meeting scheduled for the 11th. Keep both of those for now. We don't need the 11th, change that. So obviously town meeting set on. I don't think we have anything currently on the calendar for the 18th. Folks. Yeah, through the 11th. Do you want to go ahead and put something down?
I'm
on
just
the 18th
wondering just
before-
if town meetings.
It's the 19th, right? Is it?
I think I had it on
Or
my
the-
calendar.
I'm looking at it now, that's a Thursday, that feels
It's
weird. It's probably just-
Tuesday,
I think it's the
Wednesday.
6th, I think it's
Yeah,
16,
16,
17.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
so. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I have it in my calendar, 16, so
Okay,
then that doesn't make sense.
yeah, I would say it wouldn't make sense, I'm not sure, and that's,
I mean, that
That's a
the
federal
18th
holiday.
would make sense.
Oh, right.
yeah, I mean, for the purpose of. So I think we can do, I do think then we'll have one on the 25th.
Yeah.
25th, I am not here, so
It's fine.
I-
Are you here out that whole week?
out from the 19th to the 25th. So I'm back on the 26th.
Then maybe we do want to hold something on the 18th, just in case there's any
Yeah.
final thing
Mhm.
Yeah.
to do before end of the fiscal year. And that's it. Great, anything else to discuss with future meetings, Richard?
And I know it's late, but I just wanted to, for the finance report structure, did we talk about? Are we going to just talk about that at a future meeting as well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Don't push that. And you did provide a copy of template. I use this for the internal controls for the federal grants
Yes,
in the folder too. Folks have to see.
it is there.
All right, there's nothing else, then I will make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? We are adjourned at 9:06.
Thank you.
Three, two, one.